I'm Bob Short, and this is Reflections on Georgia Politics, sponsored by Young Harris College, the Richard B. Russell Library, and the University of Georgia. Our guest is Justice Harold Clark, former state legislator and Chief Justice of the Georgia Supreme Court. We're honored to have you.
Well, I'm honored to be here.
Forsyth, Georgia.
Right.
You grew up there.
Born there, and if somebody asked me if I've been here all my life, and I said, not yet, I hope.
Well, tell us about your growing up in Forsyth.
Well, Forsyth was a different world then from what it is now, and as is everything just about. For instance, the house in which I was born and which I still own, it's being used as a law firm. It was a dirt street in front of it because at that time, when I was a little fella, the only paving we had in Forsyth was within one block of the courthouse, and our home was 2 blocks away, so we were on a dirt street. And when I was about 5, 6 years old, they paved that road to make the highway to Indian Springs and Jackson. But along that street, interestingly enough, there's only one house, one building of any sort on that street that goes down beyond where our house was, is that house. All the rest of the buildings, there are 2 banks, there's a liquor store, there are many motels and every kind of fast food thing you can think of, and it's just a different world. You would not recognize what I would see when I was growing up. And it stayed that way pretty much so until probably during the 50s. Things started changing. But I really enjoy thinking about the 30s more than other times and early 40s. It was an area where just down the street, a short distance, you could cross a railroad, make a turn, and go by where now there is a Walmart, and walk down there, and there was a place called the Blue Hole. And that's where I learned how to swim. And it was forbidden for children because the parents didn't want them going down there, getting in the water and getting drowned, perhaps drowning. So what we would do, we'd go swimming, and then we'd get up on the railroad track and sit there with the sun would shine on our head enough to where we'd be dry, and your mama would go out and put their hand on your head to know whether you'd been in the Blue Hole. But that was an interesting time, of course. Almost all the little boys there had pets of one sort. We had an array of pets, none were any great advantage to anybody for any purpose except us individually. Now, I will change a little bit on that about the pets. My sister had a boyfriend who gave her a greyhound, and the greyhound was fully grown, but it was shy, and we had a terrible time getting the dog so he would even let you touch him. And I came to find out that he had some arthritis or rheumatism, something, and could sometimes run like the wind, and other times just couldn't move at all. And I think probably somebody was racing that dog, and it beat him because he couldn't run. And that was his shyness, and that was the most talked about of the dogs. But my favorite was one named Duke, who was devoted to me and went everywhere I went. If I would go to a movie, he'd try to get into the movie. And I remember then I would used to tie him to a spigot close to the backyard and ask my mama to untie him after I'd been gone for a while. And sure enough, going on up there, probably half hour later, that dog would find me in the movie. And my mother said that she'd look out there and see the dog sniffing my trail and he'd show up in the movie, and I'd have to take him back. But let me tell you another thing about that greyhound. He was devoted to my father, because my father had the patience to kind of work with him, and he would go fishing with us and things like that. But he did go to the movies with my father, and they would let him in, and he would sit there under my father's feet, so to speak, and watch the movie, I guess, or just sleep. And my father was also a minister, and he was a Presbyterian minister, and he just, I don't think he ever got paid, but and we only had services twice a month back in those days. And so one day we were sitting there, and the dog came walking down the aisle and went up there to the pulpit and sat down. And my mother reached over there and said, kind of motioned to me to go get the dog out. So I went out there and grabbed his collar and walked him on out, and came back into church, and a few minutes here came the dog again. So I went up and got him again, and then the third time that he came in, I looked up, I started to get up again, and my father said, like this, and so from that point on, he always sat there with my daddy while the sermon was being preached and the rest of the service took place. So that was probably the most talked about advent of that dog, anyway.
You wrote a book about growing up in Forsyth.
Yes.
Tell us about your book.
Well, the book is intended to preserve what it was like to grow up in a small Georgia town in between the two world wars. I was born in the 20s, and of course, I've been through a lot of different changes, and that community's made a lot of changes. This book begins with my beginnings, and a little bit before that because of some things about my parents, but it ends on the day of Pearl Harbor. And that was, I think, the big turning point of what our lifestyles have been, in perhaps that along with the time of the Civil War, were the two times it made abrupt changes in the lifestyle of people in small towns, at least, because people went off to other places. They went to wherever the Army or Navy or whoever it was sent them, and they came back more cosmopolitan than they were before they left. And I try to paint that picture as best I could and end with Pearl Harbor. But the little book has been well accepted among the local folks and some folks beyond that. But I enjoyed doing it very much. What I would do is I would sit down sometimes on Sunday afternoons or at night, particularly when I was here at the court, because at night I'd be up here usually by myself, and I'd write maybe a chapter or two at night and do it in longhand. And then I'd later dictate it on a dictating machine, and then from that I would do some editing and find a Mercer Press published it, yes.
Tell us about your parents.
Well, my father was from Virginia, and my mother was from North Georgia, from Lafayette. They had an interesting situation. Well, first my father was born on the outskirts of Danville, Virginia, but his father died at an early time, and they then moved over to Martinsville, Virginia, or near Martinsville, with her parents. Their name was Gravelly, and then eventually his mother got a job at teaching at what's the name of it? It'll come back to me in a minute. It's an orphanage in South Carolina. And so my father stayed there with his grandparents for some little time and went to military school, I think, in Farmville, Virginia. and then later came on down to Clinton, South Carolina, as and went to school at Presbyterian College. In the Thornwell Orphanage is the name of the orphanage that came back to me. And she was there, and they were really organized by the same people. Both the college and the orphanage. And my father was was one of the smartest people I've ever known. He didn't have any great abilities to make money or anything like that, but he was had a tremendous intellect, and he was the valedictorian of his class when he graduated. And then he went on up to Richmond, Virginia, and graduated from Union Seminary, Presbyterian Seminary there. And then came to, while he was there, my mother had some cousins who lived in Richmond. And she went, this was probably in 1909, I guess. And she came up there to visit those relatives. And on the day they had a graduation at the seminary, my father was one of the ones who was being graduated. And she didn't know, and he didn't know, and they didn't know anything about that until a few weeks or months later. He came to Lafayette, Georgia as a minister. And they met there, and then in 1911 were married. And the story is told that they've chuckled about it a lot, that they'd been seeing one another some, as they used to call it, and he handed her one note saying, oh golly, I wish it's a Browning poem, Robert Browning, where come live the rest of the world, I forget now, about come be my partner or something. Right. And she looked at it and smiled, according to the story, and she wrote down on it, I accept your proposal. And that was the beginnings of a long situation between them. Then after a short time, they moved to Baltimore, where he got a scholarship to do some work at Johns Hopkins and got a master's degree there, and then came back down to Atlanta, where he taught school at Old Boys High, no, not Boys High, Tech High. And one of his students was Bobby Jones, and that was one he always remembered best. And then after a few years, he had some newspaper experience while he was in college, and he was able to, well, in 1917, the owner of the Monroe Advertiser was a member of the National Guard and was called into active duty. So he had to get rid of the little newspaper, and my father was fortunate enough to get it, or unfortunate enough to get it, as case may be. But then that was in 1917, and they lived there the rest of their lives.
So you went to school there in Forsyth?
Yes.
Grade school and high school?
For all of it, from the beginning to the end. Mm-hmm. My grammar school time was not a happy time for me. I'll tell a couple of little stories about it. For one thing, I just didn't like the idea of going to school. I kind of liked the idea of being over to Blue Hole or somewhere like that, you know. And so my mother would carry me over there. It was just 3 blocks from where we lived, and she would leave, and I would beat her home. And we had a tough time making me stay there. And what capped it off was I'd been there for several days, and I didn't know that there was such thing as a restroom there. And I knew it was pretty painful staying there all day long without the use of some facilities. And so finally I was mentioning that to a young fellow who's one of my classmates, and he said, oh, they got restrooms down here. And he pointed it out to me and said, "You go right down that door there." And I went down there, and he had sent me to the girls' room. And they were all laughing and making fun of me, and I ran away, and that really upset me, you know. And so when I came out, this little fellow was smaller than me, and I started hitting him as hard as I could, and he started crying and went into the school, and I was sort of proud of myself by then. Don't like school better than I thought. And then one of my neighbors, a young lady, across the street, came over and said, "Harold," said, "I saw Walter going down, crying, going through the hall with Miss Flory." She was a principal. And he said, "I heard Miss Flory say she was going to put you on the electric spanking machine." And so I never had heard of one of those, but it didn't sound like something I wanted to experience. So I left again, and it was hard for me to get back to school. Turned out I had a wonderful first grade teacher who's still living, and we are great friends even to this day. In fact, live fairly close together. But she, when I took off that time, she came running over to our house looking for me, and I had gone home and went upstairs to a little room we call a sleeping porch, and there was a big old, excuse me for my word retrieval problems, but a big trunk up there. And I had gotten in that trunk and closed it to hide. And I don't know what I expected to do somewhere along the line, but I could hear them walking around looking for me, and I thought all sorts of terrible things were going to happen. But so I got out of that, and had to go to summer school to make up the first grade. I probably set a record to do that. And as time went on, I had another problem in grade school, and even when I was having it a little bit when I got to high school, was I think I had dyslexia. They didn't know what it was at the time, but I had a terrible time learning how to read, and my handwriting was terrible and still is. But at some point, along about the time I got into the 5th grade, I began to be able to read, but still slowly. And there may be some benefit in that because you're able to really make it stick when you read it slowly. But you just don't get as much done, perhaps. But I think now about my problems with word retrieval and other things like that. I think that may be a relapse of dyslexia, and I have terrible time trying to spell things anymore. But that's just part of the old age, they tell me.
So after high school, you go to the University of Georgia.
Yet, well, let me talk a little bit about the high school thing,
yes,
because that was a wonderful time for me. I enjoyed it thoroughly. By that time, I began to see the other side of the thing. The young girls that were there, they were awfully pretty by that time, and they still are. And I did well in high school. I tried to participate in everything that they had to go. Played football, I played basketball. I was editor of the newspaper, high school newspaper, and I was president of the class. And my top thing, I guess, that I did was got elected president of the state president of the Georgia Beta Club during that time. And so those were good years for me, and I enjoyed them, and it is something we still enjoy getting together with some of those old people that are still around. It was a very small school. I think we only had about 40 students in our graduating class, if that many. Then I did go on to the University of Georgia when, back then we only had 11 grades in school. And I know that was true with all the small town schools, I guess. And so when I got there, I was still, I was 16 years old still when I got to Georgia. And I was there for, they had an accelerated program back in those days because of the war. And that was in 1944. And so I got through with by going to some summer schools and having that accelerated class. I'd finished 2 years of school by the time I went in the Army while I was still 17 years old. No, I was 18 years old. And just as I went in, the war ended. But they didn't turn me loose. And that was one of the more fortunate things that ever happened to me, because after going to basic training in Fort Knox, I went to California to go overseas, and first from Camp Stoneman in California, and then Camp, I forget the name of it now, in Seattle. We then went on to Tokyo, and got there. Well, we first went to a place that they just based us for 2 or 3 days till they sent us somewhere. Sent me to Tokyo along with a bunch of other people, and they went into a place where they were going to interview you and pick something for you to do. And that's where we were assigned to the general headquarters. And he asked me what I had done, and I told him I'd worked around my father's newspaper from the time I could walk. And then I had edited the newspaper in high school, and had worked a little bit at the Red and Black at Georgia. And he said, well, and then after a while he said, well, I think I can place you with something that would be good. And this was some lieutenant or something, I don't know. And he said, what about going to work with Stars and Stripes? And I said, well, I couldn't have even imagined something I'd rather do than that. And he said, well, you just be a proofreader. Well, when I got there, it was a fascinating thing, really, really fascinating, that we had some really old-time, experienced, highly competent newspaper folks. The news editor of the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, one from I won't go through all those, but they were people who'd worked in big papers all around. But that was early on, after the war ended. Well, pretty soon they were gone. And before I knew it, I was up in the newsroom, and then I got to be news editor, and then I got to be city editor, and finally got to be managing editor. And I was 19 years old by that time. And it was a daily paper that went out to, I think we had about, it was close to 500,000 not population, but circulation. And it covered all of Japan, all of the China that we were involved in. We were still there, of course, at that time, and Korea and the Philippines. And what they would do is they would send out the daily every day, and they'd send one newspaper for every 4 GIs who were out there. And that was a system. And I've still got a number of those several months of the old Stars and Stripes there at home.
So then you came back to the university.
Yeah, I came back to the university and went to summer school and went into to law school in, let me see, it was in September of 1947. And then during the summer times, I ran a program a recreation program for youngsters in Forsyth, and then come back to law school every year until I graduated. And I graduated in 1950.
When did you decide you wanted to be a lawyer?
I have no idea when, because it's sort of ingrained into me. My grandfather was a lawyer, and most of the folks in his family were lawyers. His name was Hugh Lumpkin, and the Lumpkin family had been filled with lawyers. In fact, there are 4 members of the Supreme Court who were members of that family. the two most recent. Well, the very first Chief Justice was Joseph Henry Lumpkin. Then I forget the two others whose names I forget now. But then the most recent ones was myself and Charlie Weltner. Charlie was, let's see, his grandmother was a Lumpkin, I believe was who it was. But at any rate, the lawyer thing is just sort of ingrained into that family during all those years. And so I got there, and a guy was appointed in, let's see, it was in December of 1979. And went on the court at that time.
Right. When did you first get interested in politics?
Well, I guess if time you got a family full of lawyers, you got a family full of politicians too. And my father was not a good politician, but he did serve as mayor one time in Forsyth. And this, I think, is an interesting twist too. At that time, this was in the 20s, the politics there was controlled by the Ku Klux Klan. They actually had a little house where they had their meetings, and it was well known who they were, even though they wore their regalia when they went out. And but a group of men got together at a hardware store one day and said, "Look, we got to stop having the mayor and everybody members of the Ku Klux Klan." And so they looked around, nobody wanted to run, and finally they looked over at my daddy and said, well, Jack said, you're going to have to be it. And he ran and won. And that was the end of the Ku Klux Klan. And I guess that was in 1929, 28, I don't know. And he, I don't think particularly enjoyed that work, but incidentally, he ended up finding being anyway, the superintendent of schools for the county for a short time toward the end of his lifetime. And so we'd all been around politics for some period of time. And my mother had been one of the people in the committee to elect, the fellow who ran.
I bet I can guess.
Who?
Jimmy Carmichael.
No, this was way before that. This was this was for presidency.
Oh.
She was on the state committee for, he was the Catholic who ran for
Al Smith.
Yes, right, Smith, and that was a very unpopular position to take in Georgia.
Yes, sir.
But, and incidentally too, the tried to tag my daddy with being a Catholic because Ed Smith was Catholic, but in spite of the fact that he was Presbyterian minister, and they did all sorts of stuff, but it ended up all okay. But and we were talking about it coming up here. I remember going to see Roosevelt over at Barnesville when he was supposed to throw the switch to get the REA going in that area. Mm-hmm. He did not throw the switch because they didn't want him holding some heavy electricity in their hands. Mm-hmm. No, but it was a fascinating time because that was the time that he said that Senator George and I do not speak the same language. Mm-hmm. And then Senator George got up and said, I accept the challenge. Mm-hmm. And because he said, the president said he was supporting Lawrence Camp. Mm-hmm. And I think Gene Talmadge would have won had it not been for the president coming down to tell folks how to vote.
Right.
But some people also said that what what the president did not want was Gene Talmadge coming to the Senate. So that's his way of being sure that Senator George got back in. Now, who knows which is right.
So you ran for the House of Representatives.
1960. Yes, did, and had an opponent. I was fortunate enough, I guess maybe unfortunate enough to have won, and I stayed there 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
And it was an interesting time, and it couldn't have been a more interesting time really, because the first week or so we were there was the integration of the University of Georgia.
Mm-hmm.
And you remember all of that hoorah that was going on. And the fact that we then, within a week or so of my first term there, we did away with all of the segregation statutes, and just said, okay, we're not going to close down the schools,
Mm-hmm.
and we didn't, and that was to the benefit of everybody, I think.
Mm-hmm. Back in those days, we had what was known as a county unit system.
That's right. And that came in the second term I was there at the legislature, yes.
And it was abolished by the courts.
Yeah, well, I think we eventually, we did it with under duress, I guess you'd say. And that was, but it was done by the legislature, knowing that it wasn't any way we were going to do otherwise.
Mm-hmm. Incidentally, you came in 1960. Isn't that when Speaker Murphy and Zell Miller came to the legislature?
We all three came at the same time, and we used to call us the class of 1961. Actually, was sworn in 61,
Right.
ran in 60. But and in fact, I saw Zell about 3 weeks ago up at Brasstown Valley, and we talked at some length about that. And of course, now I first knew Zell then, but Tom and I were in law school together.
Oh, really?
He was 1 year ahead of me. He used to say all the time we were classmates, but we were pretty close to being classmates. But I had lots of experiences with him. Lots of times we would disagree, and lots of times we would agree. But I think he was a great speaker. He held things together about as well as anybody could possibly do. And sometimes I think folks blamed him for his style, when really his style was on purpose to accomplish what he did.
Mm-hmm.
And he did so much for Atlanta that folks don't even think about.
Mm-hmm.
Things like the World Congress Center and MARTA
Mm-hmm.
would not have been there had it not been for Tom Murphy.
So, what do you remember about your first term in the legislature?
Well, I remember first that the integration thing. It was tough, and I think I'm right. That only 3 members of the House voted against doing away with the old system, which I think was a real fine thing to have happened to the Georgia legislature.
Mm-hmm.
Then shortly after that, there was a real battle between the Speaker and the governor on who would really control the money situation. And it ended up that Vanderbilt won it, but then they did a compromise during the interim and came up with something that's been workable. But before that, the governor just did all he just bring the bill over there and say, here's your money bill.
Mm-hmm.
And so everybody would say, aye. And that all changed in, let's see, that would have been, in 61.
Mm-hmm.
And, but it was a bitter fight. I remember they had all the leaders up there fussing in one way, the Speaker on one side and the governor on the other side. The Speaker got up and said, now, I see all these folks up in the gallery, and I see all these folks that the governor sent over here, but said, I'm the one who appoints committees, and I'm the one who allows you to speak. And so I just want you to remember that when you vote on this bill. And I voted with the governor, but and I think things were not easy for me in the House for a while, but then all that changed by the next governor taking place, and new speaker came along.
Right. You authored several major bills. One that comes to my mind is a bill that was known as Abolish Atlanta, but it really wasn't your intention to abolish Atlanta.
Well, it would not have abolished Atlanta at all, and there was, I think that Rema Tyson jokingly wrote a headline that called it Abolish Atlanta. But really what it was to say that when any county reached a population of 600,000 persons or more in any decennial census in the future, that there would be only one governing authority to handle all the governing of matters of that whole county, and that the name of the county would be the name of the largest city in that county, which specifically said that it would preserve Atlanta. Mm-hmm. And so, but that really at that time, it would only have affected one county, because Fulton at that time was the only one with 600,000. But people. Probably by the following time, DeKalb County would have gone into it as well. Mm-hmm. But it came very close. The first time was in the fairly late in the term of I forget exactly what year it was, but and we just introduced a bill, and it became clear that it had to be a constitutional amendment. So the next year we introduced a constitutional amendment, and it went from there. Lost, but close.
After several court decisions, the state was required to reapportion its legislative bodies. And if I remember correctly, you had the Clark plan.
Yeah, it was sort of, at that time we didn't recognize that we could not also keep the Senate on just, let everybody have one, so to speak. And, and I don't remember all the details of that now because it didn't get very far. But I think we were talking about having 100 members of the Senate, and that they would be pretty much like they had been, that every county would have at least one senator. Mm-hmm. And, let me go back. It would be 159 senators, because every county would have a senator, but then the others would be apportioned by population. Mm-hmm. But then the courts later said that you got to do both of them. And my idea was that if they can do that in the United States Congress, why can't they do that with the Senate in Georgia? Well, the thing is that for the states is unconstitutional, but the Constitution can't be unconstitutional. And the provisions in the Congress is part of the Constitution, of course.
I'm sure you remember the election of '62.
Oh, yes.
Sanders versus Griffith.
Well, I was very active in that one. In fact, I remember we came, I guess Carl would remember this. Of course, I practiced law with Carl for 12 years after that, many years after that, until I retired 3 years ago. Mm-hmm. But during that campaign, I got a call from Bob Reynolds. You remember Bob? Mm-hmm. And he was kind of sort of handling this stuff in the office. And about my age, he was young, and he said they were going to have a TV thing that they wanted to get some people to come in and tell what was happening in their county and so forth. And you had about 4 or 5 people. And so I said, yeah, I'd be glad to do that, and came up here, and it was going to be done live. And it was late in the afternoon, early in the evening, I forget which. Channel 2. I mean, yeah, Channel 2, and we got there, and Carl wasn't there, and he was up in Rome or somewhere, but on his way back down there, so he came running in at the last minute, and he said, "Now, what's this all about?" He said, "Well, you just gonna ask these fellas questions about what's happening in their area." And he said, "Well, we can do that." And so Carl went around to each of us, and we said whatever we were going to say. And then he got through, and he said, "Well, I really enjoyed seeing all my friends here, and I hope you keep working hard for us," and so forth. And like he was going to finish it up. It'd been a half hour. And somebody held up a board there with chalk on it saying, "Another half hour." And so Carl didn't know he was going to have to do that. We didn't either. So, but he started, he never missed a beat. He went right along and said, "Art said, this has been so much fun," said, "it's entertaining and it's helpful to everybody. Let's start back over and talk about some other questions on it." And he handled it all just beauty without anybody knowing that it was all absolutely just left up to him to do as needed to be done. And it turned out, of course, that everybody did their share all right, and the governor won, and we were very happy about that.
Historians are saying that that election turned Georgia in a new direction. Do you think that's true?
I think that is true. I think that a little bit of the groundwork had been done during the Ellis Arnold period. But it didn't last. His just fizzled out. But I think Carl really started so many things. Some of the things were, even after he got out, when they started looking around for about Major League Baseball and getting a stadium in Mills Lane, and the mayor and Carl got together, and as somebody said, they built a stadium on land they didn't own for a team they didn't have, or something like that. But they built it.
Right.
For money they didn't have, land they didn't have, money they didn't have, and a team they didn't have.
He was very active in getting sports. He also was active in getting the Atlanta Hawks here.
Yes, he was one of the part owners at one time.
Right. You were in the legislature in 1966 when you had the privilege of electing the governor.
Yes.
Tell us about that. That must have been an exciting time.
It was, but I think most of us sort of felt that we ought to vote the way our districts voted.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I did. Now, you remember, for instance, George Busby was, at that time, I think, he was the chairman of the our caucus, of the Democratic caucus. And so that morning before all this started, he got up and said, "Well, I want to resign as chairman of the caucus." And everybody said, "Why?" And he said, "Well, my district has voted for Callaway, and said I feel obligated to vote for Callaway," and he did. Well, my district had overwhelmingly voted for Maddox, and so that's the way I voted, and I think that was the way most of them did the thing, and it was probably the appropriate way to do it.
You remember the Julian Bond case?
Yes, I do.
You were there?
Yeah, I was there at that time, and that had, of course, to do with the seating of Julian Bond, and the issue. And he was not. Some people say he was the first African American to come to the House. That wasn't true. There was already several of them before he got there. It had to do with the business of burning of the flag, and mainly burning of not the flag, but the
draft card.
Draft card, yes. And I don't know whether he ever burned his or not, but he had said something like that he would if it came up. And at that time, that was sort of like the situation we've got now. In fact, there's so many similarities between Vietnam and Iraq in a way that.
Why did you decide to leave the legislature?
Got tired of it, and my children were getting older, and I was needing to be doing some more law practice, and so I think a combination of all the three of those. The old friends that I'd had, we had sort of gone, and it just wasn't like it was.
Did you practice law in Forsyth, or did you remain in Atlanta?
Well, I practiced law in Forsyth until I went on to court.
Mm-hmm.
And I went on to court in, as I said, in 79, right at the end of 79.
What were some of the most noteworthy cases you handled on the Georgia Supreme Court?
Well, I'm going to mention two that nobody ever pays any attention to anymore. One of them involved, I think, in this grand sum of $200 or something like that. There was a lawsuit in Twiggs County that where during court time, I think it was Twiggs County, the clerk of court was authorized, which started hiring some extra help during court week. And so they would hire a couple of new people, extra people, because that clerk would have to be up in the courtroom. Mm-hmm. And the Board of County Commissioners would not pay the $200. But the Constitution said that they're supposed to keep the thing going, and they could not go could not keep it going without having that kind of money. People not going to just volunteer. So at any rate, I wrote the little opinion that said that these were separate. This was a separation of powers, the judicial power and the legislative power, and that was a judicial sense on a local level, and it was also the county commissioners were the same as the governor when it comes to something like that. Mm-hmm. And so at any rate, that was one that I think we went through the thing into a bigger reach, mm-hmm. in saying that there were certain things that the judicial branch had the right to do, and that the what do you call it? The governor's lower part of the government did not have the right to do, mm-hmm. and it was a separation of powers issue, really. Mm-hmm. And then there was another one that we hear so much about the time it takes to get things done in the legislature, courts particularly. And back in that era, we were pretty slow, but we were not as slow as most were, because the Supreme Court of Georgia has a two-term rule. Mm-hmm. That if a case comes to you, you have 3 terms a year, and if a term comes to you in that term, if a case comes to you in that term, then it's got to go out the next term later. So you've got to move that within a pretty quick time. But this was one that went far further than that. And it's really not even except just a comment in the law books. But this proves what can be done. There was a case in Griffin, Georgia. Well, actually, it was in Butts County. But a woman was pregnant, and she was about to give birth to the child. But they said that it was what they called, I can't call it right, it's on the tip of my tongue, but it was a thing that meant that she had to have a cesarean section, had to have it or she would die, and the child would die. And her husband, and I don't know whether she felt as strongly about it or not, well, but the husband was insisting that she not have a cesarean section, and so the hospital in Griffin said, well, they're not going. They were going to do it anyway because it's just something that needs to be done. So the case was between the hospital and the woman or her husband. This case might have been, and all this happened just instantly because this was something that couldn't wait. It had to happen. And so one morning they came to court, and the court said that they could have the cesarean. And then they came with an appeal, all without any papers or anything, because it was going, within the next day or so, it was going to be over. And so we got a call from the clerk of court in Jackson, Mr. Oh gosh, know him well as know my own name, we can't get it. But anyway, he called us and told us what had happened, and we said, well, you get the court reporter to transcribe whatever she can that took place, and then you bring all those folks up to the Supreme Court, and we're going to deal with this thing. And we did, and we worked on it, heard what they had to say in the afternoon. We sat down then that night in the courtroom, and not the courtroom, but our place we had the conferences. And we argued it out, and we decided unanimously that they could do the cesarean. And it just shows what can be done if you've got to do it. Mm-hmm. And I think that was right at the very beginning of my time on the court. And best of my recollection, there was nothing to be said much about that, because it didn't come to us in the usual way. But I think Harold Hill wrote a piece went into the in the law books, and he had praise for the system that it did work when you had to do it. Then along about that time, there were an awful lot of changes. I mean, the court changed enormously from 1980 until 1985. Part of it was there were a lot of changes on the court. When I got there, I was the next youngest person there, and Harold Hill was younger than me, but most of the others were not there. And I know when I left the court, it occurred to me that I was the only one who was a World War II veteran left, and there's never been another one, and there never will be another one. But at any rate, we did a lot of things that were different. For instance, the way things used to work, you will still do, as far as I know. Cases come to the judges just on a random basis. If I got one, the next one to go to the next judge, and so forth. And unlike the United States Supreme Court, where the Chief Justice assigns them, but that's not true in the Georgia Supreme Court. And what would happen then is, I got a case, and what I would do is I'd write an opinion, and I'd bring that opinion to the court. And if they voted for it, then that's fine. If they didn't, then they'd send it back to me to rewrite it the other way, and then I could dissent. Well, that didn't make any sense. And that was one of the main changes we made. We made another change. We actually did not actually argue the case among the members of the court until we had the opinion written. Mm-hmm. Well, that ought not to happen either. Mm-hmm. So what we'd do is we'd have a meeting of the court after hearing arguments or after reading briefs, and say, well, now, what do you think about this case? And then that would give some guidance to the members of the court as what ought to be done. And then we went through all the business of getting computers and things of that nature. It's just a different animal today than what it was then.
If you will, Mr. Chief Justice, Tell us a little bit how the Supreme Court of Georgia operates.
Well, of course, the court is in the judicial building, and I've always thought it ought to be purely a judicial building, not have the Attorney General in there, because that's sort of a conflict of interest, but that's another question. But it's been there since the early 50s. When I was sworn in as a member of the bar of the Supreme Court, the Supreme Court offices and the courtroom itself were in the Capitol. The room that became known as the appropriations room, it was a old courtroom. And I was sworn in right there back in 1950. So about 52 or 3, this building, present building, was built. The Court of Appeals is on the 4th floor. Supreme Court is on the 5th floor, and the courtrooms are on the 6th floor. Excuse me. But the way it works is that both, there's a courtroom for the Supreme Court and a courtroom for the Court of Appeals. They're on the 6th floor, and the cases flow to the 5th floor for the Supreme Court, and it goes to the clerk's office. They go to the clerk's office, and they're put on what we call a wheel. Then they go not alphabetically, but just in the way they come to the court itself, with one exception: death penalty cases. There's a separate wheel for death penalty cases, and I think there may be 1 or 2 other things that are done specifically different, and all this may have been changed somewhat in the years that. Well, let's see. I left there in left there in 94, so it's been nearly 15 years. Mm-hmm. So things undoubtedly have changed in the years that I've not been there. But the what then happens is that each judge will get the briefs that come from every judge gets those that come from the lawyers, but only one judge gets the full transcript, even though any other judge, if that judge wants to look at the transcript, you go by and just say, let me borrow that transcript, if it's too voluminous, you'd sit there in the other judge's office and do it. Probably the longest one that I remember was the children's murder cases. Those were just stacks so high of testimony and so on, and reading through all that was tough. Mm-hmm. And that was one of the tough cases. It had some real tough things. And incidentally too, on that case, we ended up with different judges writing different sections of it. I don't know whether that's generally known or not, but it worked, and I think and hope that we did right, and but that's true with every case, of course. Then after they get to the judge, each judge has 2 law clerks, and those are lawyers. Some of them are career people who stay in that position forever. Some of them are otherwise. I tried to kind of rotate that, have one who's a career person and some. Now that when I first got there, I had 2 very fine clerks, but you don't keep, even though you intend to keep them forever, they go to higher places. One of them ended up being a law professor, and another one ended up being the chair of the Workers' Comp Board. And so, I mean, naturally they go move sometimes. But the ideal thing would be to have a career person and one who's a new lawyer. With the way I did mine, I'd try to read through the briefs and go through somewhat at the beginning of the transcript, which is much more voluminous than the briefs. And then I would come up with, write a little memo of what I thought the result ought to be in the case, and then maybe write up a few things about what I would like for the law clerk to look for on it. And then I would get back with the law clerk, and we'd end up with some of the stuff would be almost entirely written by the law clerk, if what he or she came up with. And I don't ever remember doing one that I left word for word on what they wrote, but I do remember that a lot of what goes in it came from them. And after that, then you write up one of these things in an opinion, and you circulate it to all the members of the court. And then the court meets in almost weekly, and sometimes more, in bank. And we would sit there then, and we'd go around the circle. The chief would sit here, and the newest clerk, newest judge would sit right there and going around like so. And you would, they would have the opportunity then to tell what their position was on this opinion, which you've already read, everybody has. Mm-hmm. You hope they have, and I think they have. And then you would have a discussion. Some of them would just be real quick, because it'd be obvious that that was correct. But many times everybody say, well, yeah, the result is good, but I don't like this part. Mm-hmm. And so you'd maybe make a change right then, or you might send it back to the judge to redo some portion of it. And that's fairly typical of the circumstances. Sometimes it's quick, sometimes it takes maybe 3 or 4 visits to the bank meetings. Mm-hmm. And so then finally you would have the vote, and you would be ready to send it to the business of getting it printed up and mm-hmm. carried out. Mm-hmm. So that's generally what, in a nutshell, what happens. But of course, there's lots of agony and whatnot before you ever get even to bank. Mm-hmm. But sometimes you almost get. Let me go back and say this. One of the things I worried about when I went on the court was that I'd been living the life of an advocate for a long, long time, and somehow going into some situation where you're not an advocate, but you're just trying to do what's right and do what's legal. And I thought I'm not going to be able to argue like I used to. The first time I went into one of these meetings en banc, as some folks would say, there were a whole bunch of fairly controversial cases there. And when all these judges started arguing about them, I said, I'm right back in the briar patch. They found I found a place where you still can argue and disagree, mm-hmm. and certainly a lot of that really happens.
At one time, you served on the Georgia death penalty assessment team. Has the ever-growing alternative of life without parole replaced the death penalty in Georgia?
I don't know. I thought some years ago that the death penalty was on the way out. But it seems in more recent times, people have become, the people, and I'm not talking about individuals, but the people as a group, seem to be more pro-death penalty than they used to be. When I was practicing law, I think there were only 2 death penalties handed down in our circuit in all those years. And one of them became very, very controversial, and finally there was no death penalty handed down. But now it's not all that unusual anymore. And so I don't know what the result's going to be, and it's going to be up to the people. Now we had one judge who's dead now, and, who never voted for a death penalty case. And I had really worried about it myself. But I figured as long as it was a law, then I didn't have any choice but to if it met the what the law has to say, then if I was going to be there, I had to go with what the law said. But I think I don't know whether the federal courts will do something with it. I don't know whether a lot of the states have done it themselves, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, there's been these things about going in and looking at taking a relook at some of them later on.
Well, DNA
Yeah, that's changed a lot.
changed a lot, hadn't it?
It has.
You also chaired the Joint Commission on Alternative Dispute Resolution. That's arbitration.
In arbitration and mediation, more mediation than arbitration.
Yeah. How are the courts involved in that process?
Well, there's two ways. Most of these things come up by agreements with the parties. Now, I did, when I came to Troutman Sanders, they right off the bat put me as chief of the ADR section, not section either, you call it, well, anyway, the little group that did this work. And I did an awful lot of that for 12 years there. And most of them that I got were where the lawyers would get in touch with you and say, look, are you in a position to mediate this, or arbitrate? And they would have agreed already in advance what alternatives they might, as to people, they might have to do that. And it has worked well. You don't hear much about it. One that I did twice was the labor union in MARTA when they were redoing their contracts. And both times we were able to work it out before I had to decide it myself. Under that statute, it's not just pure mediation. You try to bring them together if you can. If you can't, then you got to write the thing, and you're it. And I just always told them, you don't want somebody as mean as me and as dumb as I am deciding this. You're all in a better position to do it than I am. So in that kind of approach has worked with a lot of those cases.
In cases where you render an opinion, is that the final answer?
You mean in mediation or
Mediation, yeah.
No. That mediation is bringing the people together, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. A lot of times, perhaps more than likely, they won't agree at that time. But the closer they get to trial, the more apt it is they'll come back and say, "Yeah, we will." But mediation itself is not doesn't have any tools that could require folks to do anything. Arbitration can or cannot. It can be where it's just final, and that depends on what kind of agreement they've got.
Let's talk for a minute about our friend Charles Weltner. You served with Charles. You were very close to Charles. In fact, you did one of the most wonderful things that I've ever known, and that is you resigned as Chief Justice so Charles could serve as Chief Justice before his death, which had always been a lifelong ambition of his.
Well, you know, the very first Chief Justice of Georgia was his great-great-great-grandfather. I think those are the number of greats involved. And I think that was part of his feelings about it. But Charlie was one of a kind. my first acquaintance with him was when he was courting his first wife, and I was courting my only wife at the same institution. And our paths would cross as we'd come to and from the dormitory there at Wesleyan. And I've just always been very warm friend of Charlie's, and when he ran for Congress and all of those things. In fact, that night that Carl Sanders came in to do his thing, Charlie was doing one for the Congress at the same time. Not same time, but just before ours. Mm-hmm. But he had more interest in more things than almost anybody I've ever seen. He was really, really what you'd call what do you call it now? Oh gosh, the word is, I'm grabbing it and I can't say it. It's Renaissance man. Mm-hmm. He was truly a Renaissance man. He wrote beautifully. He had all sorts of degrees, I don't know how many. And he did worlds of old ancient language degrees. Mm-hmm. And the things like Sanskrit, Ethiopics, and just on and on. And he was, and yet we'd argue about old prize fighters. And same way with baseball and things of that nature, which was just so far removed from the other things that are purely literary. But he was just, and just about every morning, we'd go, his office was right across the hall from mine. And we'd go over there, I'd go to his office, so he'd come to mine, and we'd have some coffee together. But as I said, he was a dear friend and a great, great person. He did some, and he got in the second profiles for profiles. Courage, yeah, for Courage book and as well.
Well, that was a very courageous thing he did.
I didn't think very wise, but it was good. But wisdom and courage are different things.
That's true. Well, we might tell folks what happened.
Yeah, he was running for re-election to the Congress, and I believe Fletcher. What was his last name?
Fletcher Thompson.
Fletcher Thompson. I started to say somebody else who's. I started to say somebody else who was in the music business, but at that time, the Democratic people who run it on Democratic ticket had to sign up oath that they would support all the Democrats. And he said that he could not do that because he could not, in good faith, sign that oath with Lester Maddox on the ballot. And so he just withdrew. And that was, it took some guts to give up the Congress seat, because I think he would have won handily.
Judge, or Mr. Justice?
Harold.
We've enjoyed visiting with you, and we appreciate your talking with us. We wish you the best of luck, and I want to thank you on behalf of Young Harris College and the Richard Russell Library and the University of Georgia and myself for being our guest.
Well, I want to tell you I enjoyed it so much, and I appreciate people willing to talk to old folks talking about old times. My wife gets tired of hearing all that, so I'm glad to find somebody who will listen.